All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. It is Tuesday morning, August the 3rd, 2021, and I hope you're having a great morning. It is a beautiful day. It's hot, but it's August, so it should be hot. Good morning. Let me say good morning to my mom. Good morning, Mama. I love you. Good morning to John and Wendy and Sutton. Good morning to Ron and Amy. Let's see here. And we've got the Eddies. Good morning to Lauren and Levi and to Valor and Haven. And good morning, Everett. How you doing, buddy? Hope you're doing well this morning. Good morning to Sharon, to Pat and Lori, to my mother-in-law. Good morning. Be careful in Orlando. And hope you're doing well there. And it's crazy out there. Good morning to Pastor and Sister Martinez and to Barbara Callahan. Good morning to Kelly Woods and Melody Woods. Hope you're doing well. Buenos dias to Elva in Mexico City. And let's see here. I think at the moment, that's everyone. We are in Hebrews 9. Hebrews 9, and let's kind of catch up on where we're at briefly. Let me give myself try to do this by within 5 to 7 minutes. I think we can do it sooner. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. Hebrews 8, after going through everything about Yeshua as the better high priest, of being of the order of an eternal priesthood, the order of Melchizedek, and we've gone through all of that. He says, now here's the main point being said in Hebrews 8:1. We do have such a high priest, such a Kohen Gadol, who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. He is a priestly attendant of the holies, or and the true tent, or the true tabernacle, which Adonai set up, not man. In verse 4, it said, there are those who offer gifts here according to the Torah. They offer service in a replica, a shadow of the heavenlies, one that is just as Moses was instructed by God when he was about to complete the tabernacle. So again, you've got this picture of our high priest. We have this kind of high priest who he's not in a replica. He's not in a replica of the tabernacle, of the tent, which is what Moses was given, of the throne room of God. He is in the heavenlies. He is at the right hand of the majesty in the true tent. Verse in the actual tabernacle, in the actual glorious throne room of God. Verse 6 of chapter 8. Now Yeshua has obtained a more excellent ministry insofar as he is the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. Better. He is better, the better priest, better covenant, better promises. Don't go backward. Everything there was foundational, right? Don't go back. It's not an invalidation in terms of a dismissal as though the first covenant was inconsequential. It was foundational, but it was all leading towards something. And so he goes on in verse 13 of chapter 8, saying, in saying new, after having quoted from Jeremiah 31, the Lord says, I'm making a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers. But I'm going to write my law on their hearts. It's going to be within them. And he says, in saying new, when he talked about a new covenant, he has treated the first as old. But what is being made old and aging is close to vanishing. Verse 9, or chapter 9, he says, now even the first one, the first covenant, had regulations for worship and the earthly sanctuary. For a tent was prepared, a tabernacle was prepared. And in the outer part, or the first part, he says, were the menorah, the table, the presentation of the bread. This is called the holy place. Verse 3, beyond the second curtain was a dwelling called the Holy of Holies. Right? And he goes on to say, look, it's not possible in verse 5. He says, right now, it's not possible to speak in detail about these things. Let me get to the main point. I'm going to focus on this second tent. He says, now with these things prepared this way, the Kohanim, the priests, enter continually into the outer tent while completing the services. But into the inner tent, once a year, the Kohen Gadol alone, and not without blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. right? So the outer tent, the priests are going in, and many of these receiving this letter, they would have been priests. And he's saying, this is where you guys went, but there were limitations. There was a limitation. The inner tent, the second tent, where the presence of God dwelt, the high priest alone would go in there just once a year. And he didn't go in there without blood. He had to go in there with sacrifices for his own sins and for the sins of the people. And he says in verse 8, but by this, the Holy Spirit makes clear, he's making obvious, he's revealing to us that the way into the most holy place, into the holies, has not been yet made manifest or revealed while the first tent is still standing. He says, which is, speaking of the first tent, he says, it is a symbol. It is a parable. The word in Greek, parabole, it is a parable for the present time. Accordingly, gifts and sacrifices are being offered that cannot make the worshiper perfect, cannot make the worshiper complete, mature, whole, to fulfill what it's intended, what God wants to do in us. The sacrifices, that which is being offered, cannot make the worshiper complete with respect to conscience, with respect to that inner man, with that the heart deep stuff. Verse 10, these relate only to food and drink, various cleansings or washings, baptisms, is regulations for the body imposed until the time of setting things straight. And again, setting things straight, and I've got it on there, you can see, is diorthoseos, which the word in the middle of that, orthos, like orthopedic, has to do with a straightening, right? Then to set straight, and so it's a second, a re-straightening, that's why in some versions it may say a reformation or reformation, but it's a reforming. It says the first was giving us a picture. It was a parable. So you don't go back, you go toward what the parable is pointing toward the inner realities. The first was doing an outer cleansing, but it didn't have the power to do a transformation in the heart. That's why the Lord says in the new covenant, I'm going to write my law upon their hearts, right? He's going to do a new thing in our hearts. And so you have this actually dealing with the spine of the issue, with the depth of the issue, with what's going on inside, a straightening that needed to happen. Until that happened, until an actual re-straightening happens, the first was just dealing with an outer cleansing. But when Messiah, verse 11, appeared as Kohen Gadol, as high priest of good things that have now come, passing through the greater and more perfect tent, the complete tent, the tent that is the goal, not a tent made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation, he entered into the holies once for all, and not by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling those who have been defiled, sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more, and he makes this statement multiple times through the book at different points, how much more? If this, with the old, how much more that? How much more will the blood of Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish. He offered himself. Unlike the other high priest, he was spotless. He was without blemish to God in order to cleanse our conscience. Or will the blood of Messiah cleanse our conscience from dead works or works of death to serve the living God? So the ashes, when it speaks of the ashes of a heifer here, it refers to a ritual that's described in the Torah in Numbers 19 for the removing of ceremonial impurity. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But anyone who would have contracted ceremonial defilement through the touching of or approaching a dead body was to be cleansed by being sprinkled with water containing some of the ashes of the heifer. So that's why you have this allusion to the ashes of heifer sprinkled on those who have been defiled, so as to purify them or to sanctify them in respect to a bodily cleansing. But what Yeshua has effected here is not some mere outward cleansing, right? It's not simply an outward cleansing, but he has done something that deals with the inner man, right? He has offered himself up to God to cleanse our conscience from dead works. So verse 15, so there we are, 10:12. It's 10:12. So I almost got there in time. For this reason, through this, because of this, it says, he's the mediator of a new covenant, in order that those called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has taken place that redeems them from the violations under the first covenant. I want to kind of give you the literal ordering of the way the text reads in the Greek. So it says this, and I've got it where you can follow. He says, and through this, he is the mediator of a new covenant, in order that, and then there's sort of a pause, that kind of a statement in the middle that tells us what's happened. In order that, since a death has come, to deliver, to release, to loosen us, the word luo, to loosen, to release us from the overstepping, from the transgression surrounding, concerning the first covenant. There's a death that has occurred to release us, to set us free from the transgression surrounding the first covenant. So that's sort of put in the middle of the sentence. Through this, he's the mediator of the new covenant, in order that those called might receive the eternal inheritance. So there's an inheritance being spoken of here. And the focus here, it's back in verse 14 saying, look, Yeshua's sacrifice was enacted to cleanse not just our outward, but to cleanse our inner, to cleanse us in the deepest parts of us. And that was really a point that Yeshua continually made. Like during his Sermon on the Mount or Sermon on the Plain, he would say in Sermon on the Mount, he's like, you've heard that it was said, do not kill, right? But I tell you, don't hate, right? He goes past the surface to deal with the intentions, with the motives, what's going on inside, right? Hebrews 4:12, the voice of God, the word of God is like a scalpel, right? It's like a two-edged dagger, a scalpel that divides bone from marrow. In the way that it divides bone from marrow, so it divides soul and spirit. It divides our actions from the very intentions of our heart. It cuts right down to the heart of the matter. And so Yeshua said, you've heard it was said, don't kill. But the issue is deeper than that. Don't have hate in your hearts. You've heard that it was said, don't commit adultery. But the issue is deeper than that. Don't have lust in your hearts. It's not what goes into a man that defiles him, right? That's not what makes you unclean. It's what comes out of a man that defiles him. It's what's in the heart. So that he would continually point to the issue, the point of it all. And so the first covenant was violated continually, right? Outwardly and inwardly. But a death has taken place, a death that redeems or frees us from those violations. And so the writer of Hebrews makes these 3 points for that Yeshua is the mediator of a new covenant, a better covenant. That covenant is established through death. And then third, that the death of Yeshua brings about the forgiveness of sins. And so now the writer begins to, he just said, he's become the mediator of a new covenant so that we who were summoned, invited, called, would receive an inheritance. And so with that language, inheritance in play, the writer begins to have a sort of a word play in regard to the word diatheke, which is covenant, but in the common Hellenistic Greek mindset of the time, diatheke also referred to a last will and testament, what we would call a last will and testament. So in the mind of the greater culture, diatheke referred to that, like a will, a testament. And yet within the minds of Jewish people, it was the word that was used 270 sometimes in the Septuagint to speak of the covenant. And so it would carry kind of both the weight of both of those ideas. And so with that, he makes sort of a wordplay here. Verse 16, he says, where there's a covenant, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a covenant, verse 17, is secured upon the basis of dead bodies, or necrois, it could be, or of someone who's dead, someone dying, since it has no strength as long as the one who made it lives. So covenant, first of all, requires death. When God made a covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15, the cutting of the covenant involved a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, a young pigeon. They were brought and they were cut in half, right? And split. And so he had to walk through. There was a walking through the split pieces. The vultures, they actually attempted to interfere, but with the covenant. But Avram drove them away. And then it says, a smoking fire pot with a blazing flame passed between the sacrificed pieces and made the covenant. So death was, first of all, in regard to the idea of a covenant, death was required for the covenant. But again, on the basis of what the author has just made reference to this inheritance. And so he uses this wordplay because in first century Hellenistic thought, Greek, the primary use of the word diatheke, of covenant, was that of a testament. So we say New Testament, Old Testament, but in terms of like last will and testament, the way we think of that. And again, in the Jewish understanding, it would have carried the idea of the biblical covenant. So in English, sometimes when you're reading through this part of Hebrews, it can be a little hard to follow because you're trying to grasp what he's saying. But if you insert the wordplay like that, kind of the idea of last will and testament, it makes it becomes a little clearer. So for instance, let's read verse 16 again. Where there is a last will and testament, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a last will and testament is secured upon the basis of somebody dying. Since it has no strength, it has no power, it's not enacted as long as the one who made it is alive. Right? So the writer of Hebrews says Messiah Yeshua is the mediator of the new diatheke, of the new covenant, of the New Testament, and there is one kind of diatheke, one kind of covenant which serves particularly well, and that's the idea of to illustrate his ministry, and that's the testamentary covenant, which does not come into effect before the death of the person. And so it's with this new will and testament, the validity depends on the reality of the death of the author. The enacted ramification of your last will and testament becomes effective when there is a dead body, right? The dead body of the one who made the testament. So now the author's not abandoning the Hebrew understanding of covenant, of diatheke, of testament, of brit, which involves death. He's simply making an illustration, right? That's here based on what would have been commonly understood at the time. He's doing a wordplay, but the fact is that in both cases, the ancient Hebrew concept of covenant, as seen in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Scriptures, or in the more contemporary idea at the time within Greek-thinking world, for a covenant to be effected, that there had to be dead bodies, someone had to die. In both cases, there had to be death. He continues now making the connection more closely to the first covenant. He goes, that's why, verse 18, that's why not even the first covenant was inaugurated, brought into newness without blood. For when every commandment had been spoken, verse 19, for when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the Torah, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and he sprinkled both the book itself and all the people. The language for the book itself, it uses this word basically that it's let me see here, where do I have it? It uses the word for scroll. It's I don't. Okay, never mind. Anyway. So he sprinkled the book itself and all the people. Verse 20. He said, "This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you." So there are two primary things that are being alluded to here. The first one is the inauguration of the first covenant as seen in Exodus 24. Exodus 24, verses 4 through 8. So Moses wrote down all the words of Adonai, then rose up early in the morning and built an altar below the mountain along with the 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. He then sent out the young men of the children of Israel, who sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings of oxen to Adonai. Then Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and the other half he poured out against the altar. He took the scroll of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. Again, they said, "All that Adonai has spoken we will do and obey." Then Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant which Adonai has cut with you in agreement with all these words." Now, in the Exodus account, there's no mention of what the writer has spoken of mixing the sacrifice with water, with hyssop, and scarlet wool. But those things are more clearly expressed in Numbers 19, which we're not going to read, but just to give you the idea of what would happen, you'd have a perfect red heifer, female cow, which had never been yoked up, had never been put to work, was to be slaughtered outside the camp of Israel in the presence of, in Leviticus 19, of Eleazar, the priest who was representing his father Aaron, the high priest, who was then to sprinkle its blood 7 times in front of the tabernacle. The body of the heifer was then to be completely incinerated, so that Eleazar would throw cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet thread into the burning fire. When everything was consumed, then the ashes were gathered up and stored outside the camp to be used as occasion required for the preparation of the waters for the removal of impurity. So anyone who would have if you contracted ceremonial defilement through the touching or approaching of a dead body, you were to be cleansed by the sprinkling of this water with the ashes of a heifer. And so that's where you have this allusion to, this pointing toward that here in the book of Hebrews, that there was death and that was required for there to be a cleansing of the defilement. Verse 21, and in the same way, he sprinkled the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry with the blood. Verse 22, and nearly everything is purified in blood according to the Torah, and apart from the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Right? So the tabernacle was sprinkled with blood, all the vessels of service were sprinkled with blood, not just the people, not just the altar, but according to the Torah, nearly everything is purified by blood. Nearly everything is used rather than an absolutely everything, because there were like occasional exceptions. For example, in Leviticus 5, a poor Israelite could bring 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour to the priest as his sin offering instead of a lamb, or even instead of 2 turtle doves or young pigeons. So the Lord provided these exceptions for those who were unable to bring a lamb or something that was living. But of course, we know the passage, Leviticus 17:11, for the life of the creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your lives. For it is the blood that makes atonement because of the life. Now back to Hebrews 9, verse 23. He says, therefore, it was necessary for the replicas of these heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these, right? So the tabernacle is a parable. And everything associated with it is really a parable pointing to the reality. That's the issue here. And so if it was necessary for there to be blood to purify the replicas, well, you couldn't use the blood of goats and heifers in order to do the same thing within, to bring us access into the true Holy of Holies. There needed to be a better sacrifice. There needed to be some, and that's the language here. The heavenly things themselves needed to be purified with a better sacrifice, i.e., Yeshua. So again, the writer doesn't deny that when you talk about the replicas, that there was a cleansing, as it were, for these material things. It was real and it was effective in terms of what it was intended to do. What he does deny is that the cleansing of this kind in the Torah could be of any use for the removal of inward and spiritual defilement. It cleansed the material, it cleansed the outward, but it cleansed the flesh. It did not cleanse the inward, the conscience, the deepest part of you. The various installations, the various aspects of the tabernacle, of the tent, were cleansed and fitted for worship of God by the blood of animals. These things were only copies. They were only replicas of the spiritual realities. But there's a real sanctuary. There's an actual, a genuine one. And where the real spiritual realities are concerned, there must be a superior sacrifice and a more effective cleansing that had to come. And again, the parable. So everything everyone wants to go back to, it's a parable. It's a picture to point to the real. So go toward the real. Don't go back and just stay focused on the parable. The parable was pointing to the actual, right? It was pointing to the necessity of the real sacrifice that would deal with the actual problem, right? That would deal with the heart deep issue, with the straightening up of us in our innermost place, the spirit of man, the conscience of humanity. Verse 24, for Messiah did not enter into holies or into a sanctuary made with hands. Counterparts of the true things. The word is antitupos, the antitype, the corresponding to the image of something, against the image of the actual. Messiah didn't enter into a sanctuary made with hands. He didn't go into the replica with things that were counterparts, were little models of the actual. But he went into heaven itself, now to appear in God's presence on our behalf. So now what we begin to get the picture of, now it really brings him, because it's been talking about Yeshua as our high priest, that he is our high priest. And so now we get this picture of he goes into the most holy place, into the presence of the majesty in heaven. And again, back in Hebrews 7:26, he is holy, guiltless, undefiled, separated from sinners, exalted above the heavens. He is at home in the presence of the majesty. And he's there, it says here, not on his behalf, but on our behalf, right? He goes on our behalf. That he is in the true holy place, not in the place that is shadow of it, but in the real deal. Verse 25, and when he went in, he did not offer himself again and again or continually, as the Kohen Gadol enters into the Holy of Holies each year or year after year with blood that is not his own. For then, verse 26, he would have needed to suffer again and again from the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has been revealed once and for all at the close of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So it says now he's come to the consummation of the ages. The word consummation, here it says the close of the ages is, hold on, let me find it here. Okay, yeah, so sun telia. So telea is the completion, the goal, the perfection. with the perfection, so that it's with together the full coming together of everything, the full maturation of all of the ages. He has come into the ages of eternity, the consummation of eternity, to nullify sin, to cancel sin. So again, we're getting this clear reference to Yom Kippur, where the high priest enters into the most holy place year after year with blood that is not his own. Every year this happens, right? But the offering that the high priest gives, it's a token offering. I mean, yes, it's from a goat. It's a token offering. It's a parable. It's not in and of itself actually able or effectual to atone for the sins of the people. It's the model. It's why it has to happen over and over again, to prepare us to understand the actual, to prepare us to understand what will happen, that when it happens, the real deal, it's once and for all. It's continually preparing us for what is real. It's a parable that's repeated year after year. The sacrifice of Messiah, being the real and actual sacrifice that everything was pointing toward, is effective forever. It doesn't need to be repeated. Everything was pointing to this. If the sacrifice had to be repeated for every sin and every sinner, and every year after continually, it would be absurd. It didn't have to happen over and over again, because his was pure and complete and total and once and for all. So having become a high priest in the order of Melchizedek, and being a high priest that is fully human, so he was able to go on our behalf. And like other humans, he dies just once, which that point will be made here in a second. And at the consummation of the ages, he died once to bear up the sins of humanity for all time. It says he came to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. The word for to put away is athetison, which is to annul, which is to unset, to unstand, to unappoint, to disconnect that. So therefore to annul, to reject it as invalid. There is your marriage to sin, your bondage to sin has been annulled. He has broken that. That relationship is annulled, and now you are his by his sacrifice. He is the one-time sacrifice for the eternal mercy of God that is available to all. It continues, verse 27, we're almost done. And just as it is appointed, just as it's set, it's appointed for men to die once, and after this, judgment, so also Messiah, who was offered once to bear the sins of many, he will appear a second time apart from sin to those eagerly awaiting him for salvation. All right, so right at the beginning it says, just as it's appointed for men to die once, and after this judgment. The purpose of that comparison is basically to show that just as there's one death for every person, Yeshua dies once. He died once, not repeatedly. And of course, within the passage we read, there's an echo from Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53, verse 10, he makes his soul a guilt offering. Verse 11, as a result, the righteous one, my servant, will make many righteous, and he will bear their iniquities. Verse 12, for he bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. And so we see that high priesthood being expressed in Isaiah 53. And it says, and he will appear a second time, not to deal with sin this time. He's already dealt with sin, but he will appear to those who wait expectantly for him, for that deliverance, for salvation. So here's the picture. This is still a Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement picture. Because it speaks of his two appearances in verse 26 and then again in verse 28. On Yom Kippur, the first appearance of the high priest would be outside in the outside courtyard to offer the sacrifice on the altar of the burnt offering. And so from there, he would take the sacrifice, he would take the blood of that sacrifice, and he would enter into the sanctuary carrying the blood of atonement. And in doing so, when he would go into the most holy place, He was out of the sight of the people. He was out of the eyes of the people. The people then would anxiously await his return. And so then upon having completed what he was supposed to do within the innermost sanctuary, he would then emerge, right? He would come out and reappear before the people, and who are waiting. And so now atonement has been accomplished. He has gone on their behalf and has made atonement for them. And okay, we're cleansed. That's the picture that's at play here, and that's what that was pointing toward, was what Yeshua would ultimately do. So that in similar fashion, Yeshua, our high priest, appeared for the first time, right? And we saw the sacrifice that he made for the atonement of our sins. And so now his ascension took him into the actual true tent, into the most holy place, where he is ever living continually to make intercession, it says. The other priests, they eventually died, but he lives continually to make intercession. And so he will then return and appear again a second time to bring the consummation, the fullness of deliverance, the fullness of salvation. And so you got to hang on, he's telling the Hebrews. You got to hang on to this congregation. He's saying, don't die in the desert. You've got to persevere. You've got to press on to the end. You're almost there. You're almost there. So follow the example. Imitate those who obtain their inheritance, who obtain the promise, but through trust and through long suffering. Like look at what, and so that's going to get spelled out in a couple of chapters in Hebrews 11. So that brings us to the end of chapter 9, and let me say hello to anybody that I may have missed. Good morning to Elizabeth, and to Salome and Philip and Jesse, and good evening in Scotland to Dayspring, and let's see here, we got good morning to John and Jan, and good morning to Wesley. It's good to have you with us. And let's see. Good morning to Ron and Amy. I don't know what that guy's talking about. All right. Good morning. Some cuckoo stuff. That's all right. The Lord is good and gracious, and his mercy endures forever. Okay. Yeah. All right. I think that's everyone. And all right. Well, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom, shalom. Have a beautiful day.